Welcome to today's program with the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Ron Duncan Hart, and it's my pleasure that we have the collaboration today on this program with the American Sephardi Federation, and we thank Jason Guberman, the Executive Director. I'd like to welcome Dr. Vanessa Paloma Elbaz of Cambridge University, who we take talking about the role of songs in the continuity of Sephardi life. And she will be interviewed by Stephen Ovitsky, who is a career-long executive in the music world and the recent past executive director of the Santa Fe Chamber Music Festival. In addition to his executive past, he is an expert connoisseur of classical music and, as you would imagine, and especially Jewish music traditions, having worked with the music and performers throughout his career. And let's go to the program now, and we will talk at the end.
Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Steve Ovitsky, and with me is Vanessa Paloma Elbaz, and we're going to discuss her work in the world of Sephardic music. Vanessa is a researcher on the UK research and innovation project Ottoman Oralities, Sound Media and Power, 1789 to 1922, and senior research associate at Peterhouse at the University of Cambridge. Her research focuses on tracing unbroken cultural transmission in Sephardim through music, politics, and belief, and has been funded by the European Union's Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship, the U.S. Department of State Senior Fulbright Program, and the Posen Foundation, and others. Her forthcoming monograph, Cycles of Sound, Voice, Bodies, and Belonging in Jewish Northern Morocco, will be published by Brill. She founded Choya, Jewish Moroccan Sound Archive, where she has recorded the voices of aging Moroccan Jews with an emphasis on women's oral traditions, and she chairs the International Council for Traditional Music's Mediterranean Music Study Group. She has 3 multilingual sons under the age of 15 who are fully committed to their Sephardi traditions, and I'm pleased to know all 3 of them. So welcome, Vanessa. We're delighted to be able to talk about your amazing work.
Thank you, Steve. It's so great to be here and to have this discussion together. I'm really looking forward.
As I was reading some of your most recent articles, some of which have not yet been published, I was really struck by your concept of Sontinuity. It took me a while to figure out how to pronounce it. Then I looked it up and found absolutely no definition. So tell me about what that is so we can get started with your work.
Great, thank you. I'm so glad that you're starting with that, because this is a term that I've coined, the idea of sound and music as integral and foundational for continuity, right? So I focus on the Sephardi, this idea of how we use music and sound to ensure the continuity of belief, of traditions, of lineage, of physical but also spiritual lineages of thought. And so how then do we ensure that if, let's say, we have multilingualism, how do we ensure that even if we forget the language of our ancestors, we're still remembering the concepts? And so sound and Sontinuity is one of the manners that I think is one of the most effective manners of embedding this information into the bodies and the minds of future generations too. The non-loss.
The continuity of
Yeah.
the Sontinuity.
The
Exactly.
continuity of thought. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So would one of those examples be a women's song for a wedding or for children, where the tune is being taken by the men in the synagogue to set the words of a piyut or a liturgical prayer? And then you get the women's tune, but with the men's texts.
Yes, so thank you. For example, there are in Tangier, there's this whole set of examples where you have songs that are considered los cantares de las señoras or de las judías, right? So the songs of the women, and everybody knows the tunes because they're sung at the weddings, they're sung at the hilulot, at the pilgrimages, they're sung, at daily moments when people are just kind of humming something along. So the tunes are in the ear, they're part of the soundtrack, right? And then when a man wants to index a woman of his family, often he will take that tune into the liturgy. And for example, there was this one person who would take the tune of Rachel Lastimosa, which is it's a song about an averted adultery. And he would take it and he would put it for the tune of the Musaf of the Kedusha of Shabbat, right? So it's the point of the highest spiritual content, the most kind of emanation, ephemeral moment spiritually.
In Shabbat service.
On
yeah.
the Shabbat
Yeah.
service, at the pinnacle of the service. And the tune of Rachel Lastimosa was used for the Kadosh, 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 the song of the angels, right? So here we have these seemingly opposite moments, right, that are coming together to create this unification. It's kind of like a liturgical classic, right?
Yeah.
It's known
It's
all
the
over.
main text.
The
of,
main text,
of
yeah.
the Amidah and
Yeah.
the Musaf.
Mm-hmm. So that's one kind of thing. The other kind of thing that was often done, and that is still done actually in some of the communities that are in Canada and in Jerusalem, is that they'll take some of the melodies of the women's traditional songs, and they'll put them to a piyut for one of the holidays that are one of the shalosh regalim, so one of the three main holidays of pilgrimage that were agricultural holidays. So here we have this other idea, which for me is also really interesting, the idea of woman, fertility, land, sound. Yeah, so one of the really interesting things is that actually there's, at the beginning of the tractate of the Talmud of Zraim, which is seeds, it's actually not talking about seeds or land or earth, it's talking about prayers. So this whole idea that actually that words are seeds, and that words are connected to the planting in the land and the fertility, and then that goes back to this idea of like the female body and the planting and the sowing, right? There's a song, a wedding song that is about planting and sowing and harvesting, and that had a dance that went to it. It's called Viva Ordueña. It had this dance, and actually the women would do the dance by themselves, but then sometimes the men would do the dance to kind of tease the women, because it was like a kind of off color.
Double meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's really interesting because but the idea that in the Talmud, that even like the very beginning of this tractate that's talking about the land and agriculture, it starts with the voice.
When you're talking about the Kedusha for Musaf, that's at a very, very high level. And in one of your articles, you're talking about the music, the philosophical writings about music from Spain, from Al-Andalus. You said there's music simultaneous connections to cosmology and to genealogy. Cosmology is a study of the universe. I mean, what could be greater than that? And then genealogy with people. How do you see the cosmological part of the musical connection?
Yeah, so the thing that's really interesting, and that I think that we've forgotten because of the Enlightenment, is that pre-Enlightenment, music and science was actually part of the same system, right? It was part of the quadrivium. And so the musical and the scientific, music went along with astronomy and astrology and mathematics.
Well, the modes, especially in Arabic music, the whole change from the Baghdad-centered Eastern modes to the Moroccan-centered and the Al-Andalus-centered Western Arabic modes, they're all mathematical.
Yeah, so
and the poetic modes that go with the musical modes are all mathematical.
Yeah, so there are these issues of time. I mean, I love this stuff because it's like, it's cycles of time, right? It's sonic cycles of time that have to do with vibration, right? And with the way that, and it's the physics of it, actually. It's what does the body, how does the body of the human interact with the body of the cosmos? And so this is what these writers actually, starting in the Baghdadi school, and also, I mean, even maybe before the Greek, right? But they were all kind of speaking with each other. And actually, it's interesting because there's some authors that talk about how the Greek actually have influence from the Persian, which were before, so that the Persians were already writing about this idea of the cosmological and the rhythmic. Then it goes to the Greek, and then to the Babylonian, and then we have it in the Arabic translations that then go throughout the Mediterranean basin during the time of Al-Andalus, and then it goes into Europe, and then we have the expulsion in 1492, and then the writers that leave Spain in 1492 and go, a lot of them went to Italy, some of them went to Sfat, to Safed. They have they carry with them this incredible layering of intellectual lineage, like knowledge of all these texts that are basically Greek and Arabic and Hebrew texts that are talking about the music of the spheres and the vibration and the interaction of the voice, the body, the instruments, right, the humors, the elements, and this whole kind of very square, but also in a way magical system, right? So sound did like this magical interface between the physical and the spiritual, and it was a matter of trying to understand how then could we deploy that, right? So what I think is that these writers, because of the trauma of the expulsion and because of that historical moment of dispersion and migration and difficulty and death and loss, and they were trying to understand what agency did they still have left.
Because you've also talked about how a number of the late 15th century and mid 15th century Jewish philosophers were using the concept of the Kabbalistic Sephirot to impact the world around them through music. Now, how did they tie in the Kabbalistic Sephirot to music and daily life?
Yeah, so you should know that this was basically during COVID. I went down a rabbit hole with this stuff. I had so much fun with it, and it's really fascinating because we actually haven't really thought about this from the musical sound studies side of it. The people that are working on Jewish studies and that are working on Jewish thought talk about it, but they don't talk about it from a sonic point of view that much. So this is actually a really kind of a new intervention to remind ourselves that actually they were talking about this from the sonic vibrational point of view. And basically, I mean, I'll take a couple of steps back. What they've done is they took the system of the Porphyrian tree, which was a 3rd century system of organizing ideas, right? So Porphyry in the Isagoge wrote an introduction to Aristotle's Isagoge, wrote about these the system of how one can organize classifications of ideas, and this was taught throughout the Middle Ages all over the Mediterranean basin. So it was really, it was one of these transmissions that had really permeated kind of like the ontology of thought for all of the people, of the multilingual peoples of this area, right? And so then at the moment of the expulsion, it's only actually, interestingly, it's only after the expulsion that we have the first visual representation of the Sephirot, of the Kabbalistic Sephirot, the way that we know it today. So that tree, you know, with the diagram that people know. So this actually did not, they talked about it before, but they didn't actually draw it as a tree. So what I think is that actually this, because the reason that they had been expulsed had to do with the fact that they weren't Catholic. So this was a moment of kind of religious zealotry in Spain, where they had decided that the only people, the manner to create their nation and their nationalism was that they could not have any diversity, they couldn't have any minorities anymore, and they could only have, you know, a pure kind of one nation, one religion, one self. And so they had...
Is that part of the blood, purity of blood, that later on, even someone who had converted to Catholicism was eliminated from certain types of jobs because they weren't Catholic from the beginning?
Exactly, yeah. So then this, and this idea of purity of blood had to do with contagion, and contagion even generations down, as you've just said. So and it wasn't just physical, but it was also intellectual and spiritual contagion. So this has to do with genealogies, right? So the fact that right after the expulsion, their kind of response, or one of their responses, was to write about how they were going to classify spiritually through a tree, which is a genealogy also. It's a tree of purity. And at the very bottom of the tree, at the Malchut, which is the bottom sphira, right? So it's the sphera of sovereignty, is actually also the representation of the mouth. It's the mouth, but it's also action, and it's also speech. So the fact that then we go back to the Talmud, right? This idea that speech and earth, right, and blessings are power, and then we have here that at this moment of cataclysmic rupture, their power, their only power that was left, was through the mouth, right? So it's prayers, it's speech, it's voice, it's song.
You've talked about different ways of transmitting that information, and the way you've described it in your work is the tree and the web. Tell us about what that means.
Yes, so there are two forms that this can take in society. So we have the tree is what I'm calling an arborescent, kind of top-down, linear manner of transmission, which is usually done from maybe father to son, or maybe even mother to daughter, or from teacher, master to disciple, and where we have hierarchies of genealogies, of lineages, of transmission. And so this is usually hierarchical and linear and directed, right? And the web is a rhizomic idea. So I'm taking this structural idea from the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari, the French philosophers who wrote about this rhizome and arborescence. And so the idea of the web, of the rhizome, is that it's multinodal, multidirectional, and it's non-linear, and it's constantly happening and moving and shifting, and there's no center. And so this is actually what we find very often in the manners of transmission that are usually ascribed to female repertoires. So they're repertoires that are known to be from oral traditions that don't have written support. And then the repertoires that are of the written, and that we find very often in written songbooks that are in Sephardi tradition, for example, that are the Hebrew, the rabbinic, the liturgical, those are usually arborescent. And the Sephardi Judeo-Spanish oral traditions are usually rhizomic, using very different methods to achieve its ultimate purpose, which is actually the Sontinuity, the transmission, the ultimate transmission.
And then what added to that becomes methods of transferring this information or transmission of the information in nonverbal ways? That's something else I know that you look into, the nonverbal transmission of these stories and songs.
There's a colleague at Cambridge that works on music and science, and he said to me, like our very first conversation, he said to me, well, 95% of all our communication is nonverbal. So basically, like most everything that's being transmitted is not in words. And we are so stuck in the verbal, textual, that we have somehow ceased to measure and consider all these other aspects, which are gesture, silence, maybe timbre. There's an article that I really like, the Roland Barthes, Le Grain de la Voix, where he talks about the grain, which is kind of hard to really describe, but what is this grain? Is it like the thickness of the sonic thickness, like what all can you transmit in that? Then also odor, right? Taste, mm-hmm. All these and these elements, and all of these elements are very connected with ritual, and ritual is very connected with sound also, because we do all these rituals, and that can be liturgical, paraliturgical, or semi-liturgical, right? Or maybe even not considered liturgical, but they are semi-sacred, or they're sacred, right? And this is the piece that for me is fascinating.
One of the things in your article talks about the Spanish rabbi Isaac Arama, and you said that he died in Naples soon after the expulsion. There's a quote from him that I think is so beautiful about music. In his book, The Binding of Isaac, it's a compilation of sermons, and he included arguments for Jews to use when exhorted to participate in those theological disputations with Christians that were happening at that time. And he called it the Song of the World, the Nigun Olam. And in here he states, and this is, when I was reading this, I just marked it up. One can conceive of the universe as an orchestra in which each instrument plays its assigned part. Should an instrument fail consistently, the disharmony created will disable the entire orchestra. And we all know that as musicians, having dealt with that. Perhaps the comment by our sages about David's harp starting to play all by itself may be understood simply. When man does his share, the entire orchestra comes alive and worships its maker. On the other hand, nature is supposed to provide the planet's sustenance. On the other hand, man distributing nature's bounty in a fair and equitable manner complements nature's work and completes the task of performing the will of the Creator. There are numerous verses in Scripture supporting this thesis of the interaction of the laws of nature and human behavior. I just love how he takes the concept of people playing together in ensemble and turning it into a very spiritual concept. That's something that we don't hear these days. I mean, it's 500 years old.
Yeah, we don't hear it anymore in, I'd say, in the Western world. But it's interesting because actually there's another author, a Harizi, who did a translation of and his name is escaping me right now, but from Baghdad, from the 9th century, and it's called Musreha Philosophim, and the philosophers, it's a Greek philosophers that are also talking about instruments and the sound of instrument and the being in tune, or the good song or the bad song, and the impact that has on nature. And so the whole, it's vibration, right? Yeah. It's basically about vibration, and it's how every aspect of the world and our actions are vibration. And so our speech is vibration, our action is vibration, the actions of others are vibration, what happens in the universe is vibration. And so when we are in tune with that, then it vibrates well, right? And when we're not in tune with that, then it's a bad song, right? Or it's a bad tune that needs to be recorrected. And you know what, also, Moshe Cordovero, in his Palm Tree of Deborah, there's actually I think it's an edition from the 1950s or 60s in English, a translation that talks about how in his book Shiur Koma, there's a whole metaphor about the song of the birds. And it's the creator that has created this song and taught the song to the birds that are in his tower. And when the song of the birds is correct in the manner that the creator taught the song to the birds, then it rises up. And when the song is not correct, then the creator has to go down and teach it again to the birds. And so there's this whole thing about song and the order of the universe, basically, and how then what is basically they're teaching, this is all Musar, right? It's from the ethical teachings, ethical rabbinical teachings. And so the whole idea is that music and ensembles and human behavior and human ensembles and nature and the ensemble of humans and nature are part of the way that this musar, that we need to learn to behave so that things go in the correct way.
And all that leads to your idea of the intertwining of mystical and sound, sonic and mysticism together. Everything you've just talked about leads to that connection of the two.
Yes, yeah, because the mystics were, and still are, very connected to sound. So through sound, people will do prayer and or tefillah, liturgy, the singing of psalms can be also like a form of meditation, right? If we think about the 16th century, all those rabbis in Sfat and starting the process of singing Lecha Dodi and all those prayers and all that, going out into the field and singing, and it's all about understanding that through sound we can actually maybe evade ourselves in a way, or maybe come completely in touch with ourselves. It can be both.
It could be out there or in here.
Yeah. So what is it about singing, sound, ritual, gesture that is actually really a part of the way that we connect with, I would say, beyond the limitations of our body?
So how does singing and ritual, both informal and formal, create social cohesion within those groups? What is it about that process that are in all these societies you mentioned, including Sephardi and other Jewish society? How is it that works? What happens there?
Well, I think a lot of different things work. One of them is probably biological, because when we sing together, actually our heart rate and our breathing start to entrain with each other. So there's that very physical aspect of what's happening, and then there's the aspect of creating a society where people have knowledge that belongs to the in-group, right? So then you create social cohesion through knowing the things that you have to know, right? And being able to maybe just say one word and people already recognize what that means. And so then you already have a bond with that person that you don't have to go into all sorts of explanations or kind of really parse it out. You say one word, you say kiddush, and people already know what that means, and that already creates a sense of community, right? And then there's the actual physical actions of doing things together to create a kind of a temple in space, right? That through behavior and gesture, and there's also the creation of the memory of the rituals being done. So sometimes, let's say there's somebody that grew up in a very observant community and had this for a very long time, and then they've moved to a different place where they don't have that community anymore, but they have the memory of having done that, and that is very rich in their inner life still. So even though you don't actually physically do it, but if you go back to that place, then you can reinsert in a way.
You were talking about people being inside or outside of the group. In one of the articles of yours that I was reading, you were talking about a piano concerto by Thomas Addis, one of the leading composers in England these days, who is of Sephardic heritage. I think Addis is usually a Bulgarian name, if I recall. It's called In 7 Days, and it's based on the creation story for piano and orchestra. And I've worked with him a couple of times over my career, and I know that he's never really been connected to the Jewish community. Is there anything of Sephardic nature in that piece of music, in that concerto, or is it just the title and the names of the movements?
I think that he actually took some melodic elements and wove them in, but one would not know that.
Right, the way he writes, yes.
If you would listen to it,
Yeah.
you would have no
Yeah.
idea. And then we don't see that very neatly in their output. But the thing that I always come back to and that I really think about is, well, if you in your early childhood have been impregnated with certain kinds of thought, of sound, of belief, of gesture, of ideas, that is bound to come out in your work in some way, like a shadow or an impregnation of that, or an imprint that maybe, and that's that nonverbal kind of transcendent piece that we all carry with us, that maybe we don't even realize that we're doing that. So there's something there that has to do with this information. It can't all have been, one does not truncate oneself from oneself. It's impossible.
Yeah. One of the things, another thing that you've talked about is how Muslim music from Al-Andalus, from Spain, that then was expelled from Spain, and Jewish music have grown up outside of Spain and have had a very important history within those diasporas. But another type of music from southern Spain is flamenco, and that seems to have been taken in as a national music of Spain rather than kept outside the way Jewish and Muslim music has been kept outside. What do you know about that? I mean, how is that? Because it's such an Arabic origin of sound in flamenco. How's that managed to become so nationalistic in Spain?
Yeah, well, so the story with flamenco is interesting because in the 19th century, Spain basically decided, Spain went through a big crisis in the 19th century, right? They started losing all their colonies. They had been this huge empire, and all of a sudden they had nothing, or they felt like they had nothing, right? So at this moment, then this is when they actually started looking towards the Sephardi diaspora, right? They realized, we have españoles sin patria, the Spaniards without a homeland, right, supposedly. And so they started to kind of gather Sephardi material for the Great Spanish Literature Project. But also, homegrown in their country. They had Flamenco, and they had the Gitanos, right, the Roma population.
Yeah.
And this was all of a sudden then kind of turned into a repertoire that became kind of like a sentinel, in the words of Kay of the Spanish nation, right, and of what Spanishness was. And so they took this idea from Andalusia, and they turned it into, or they used it to deploy it for the greater Spain. And so, but then again, we have this idea of this is a minority. They were reviled. They weren't loved.
I know. They were really shunned for so many decades, centuries.
Yeah, which is similar, actually. It's interesting because it's similar to the Moriscos, right, who were expelled in 1610, right? So, but then, they were still playing too much Arabic-sounding music and dancing sambras and doing things that weren't Catholic enough. So even though they had converted to Catholicism, they had to go. So then they took their Andalusian music with them, Arabo-Andalusian music, and then they had the Gitanos that they were like, okay, we'll be okay with you. And some people say that in flamenco that there were some of the Morisco elements that went into that. And so this is part of the issue. It's impossible for us to really know 100% because we don't have any textual support for this. So last year, actually, about this time last year, I was in Madrid, and I saw a play that was put on by a flamenco musician, Gitano, and it was about tres culturas, the three cultures. But he did this whole video, and in the video he had the Western Wall, the Kotel, and then the Shoah, and this whole connection of Gitanos with Sephardim, and with kind of the Jewish story and the beingness of being a Jew and the beingness of being a Gitano, which I thought was really, really interesting. And he was taught, then I interviewed him after that, and he was saying, yes, well, we have the same story, and we all come from the same root, and our musics have intertwined. And so there's really, within their narrative, this is very much a part of the way that they see it. But Spain, the kind of the official government narrative of Spain has been, this is fully Spanish, and this is part of the Spanish land and the Spanish nation, and this is the way that we sell Spain to tourists.
When you were talking about late 19th century Spain taking on Sephardic literature and things, is that the beginning of how so much Sephardic music was presented in, let's say, the early to mid 20th century as Spanish medieval music with medieval instruments and making the tunes sound like they were ancient Spanish, as opposed to those tunes mostly not being Spanish in origin and coming back from the Sephardic diaspora in the Balkans and in the Mediterranean, but for example, Victoria de los Angeles and those beautiful recordings she made, they're so totally wrong in every possible way, but that introduced a lot of people to that music.
Yeah, so this is it's Joaquin Diaz, also Garcia Lorca, also Romancero Sephardi. We have these kind of like this. What do we do with this today, right? But part of the thing that I think is interesting is that it's almost like they wanted to erase all those centuries of persecution and Inquisition and kind of like cleaning out the Jewish blood, right? And then they said, okay, so we'll collapse it all the way down back to when we were all living together, like, you know, friends in the Middle Ages, which was actually not exactly the story.
Sort of like Santa Fe.
Yes, yeah.
In many ways.
Yeah, so this idea that, okay, so if we can just go back to this idyllic moment in time and recreate the sounds of that idyllic moment in time, then maybe we will be able to learn something from that, or say that that is actually our history instead of this other history of kind of empire and brutality and cleaning out of racial differences. And so using Sephardi material, because the texts, many of the texts were actually the same texts as Spanish in Spanish oral tradition. So the person that was really behind that movement was Ramón Menéndez Pidal, who was the head of the Academia Real de la Lengua Española. So that's really interesting that he had like this big job, and then one of his big projects was the romancero, right? So it's the epic songs of oral tradition in Spain, but then also the Sephardi romancero. And you know, we have some of these same romances here in New Mexico, which I think is really amazing, and in South America. So the romancero really kind of moved out at that moment, and what I think is interesting, and what my work has been doing to kind of right that quote unquote wrong, is to say actually the Sephardim weren't singing about longing for Spain and longing for, you know, the long lost life that they had. They were actually singing these songs because they were real stories about things that happen in people's lives and the consequences of what happens if, you know, you're the princess and you sleep with a page, or what happens if you have a mean mother-in-law that doesn't like you and you're pregnant, and you know, all these things. This is what they were talking about, very real life, local reality. So instead of this kind of Hispanic idealized, you know, everybody's longing for the long lost convivencia.
One last question. You've been talking about your scholarly work, which is absolutely amazing, but you're also a wonderful performer. What are you doing with performance these days?
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, well, so recently I was also invited to perform at the Helsinki Sacred Music Festival. And it was interesting because I'd never been there, right? And I fly in and I arrive and I see this huge poster of me.
In your regalia.
In my regalia with my harp, a Helsinki Music Festival. And I thought, wow, this is, I wasn't expecting that. So, and that was a solo show. So that was really interesting because it was part of a whole week of events that was happening with choirs and new compositions. And then mine was a solo voice and harp in a black box theater, just kind of with lighting, very dramatic lighting, doing my thing, but also explaining to the audience, because of that the whole idea is to create these moments of kind of sensorial experience. But the things that I'm performing are actually things that I really want to do, and with people that I'm building, that I've been building a rapport with for many years, and that I'm able to bring in this information and the depth of this analysis into the repertoire and into the performances and tell it to the audiences. So for example, recently I performed in Ireland at the Limerick Early Music Festival, which is interesting, with 2 Moroccan musicians, and who came to Ireland. We had the Moroccan ambassador there also, which was very, very interesting. And we were talking about these repertoires from the garden, these mystic repertoires of the tree, the web, and singing the songs in Arabic, but also in Judeo-Spanish, also in Hebrew, and actually talking with the audiences about how this actually really works, instead of just thinking of some kind of medieval utopia, right? Something else recently that I also did was at the Badische Kunsthalle in Karlsruhe, which is close to Baden-Baden, with a sound artist who has taken some materials from my sound archive, from Hoya Sound Archive, and she did a sound installation in a museum. And then we did something called performance activations. So with a group of vocal sound artists, we went into the gallery and did live performances, interacting with the materials from the sound archive. So that was really, really interesting. And then we had a live radio broadcast on this. And so there are things like this that are a little bit more kind of pertinent, maybe.
But they're connected to your research.
They're completely connected.
It's
to
not
my
just
research.
going out and singing Sephardi greatest hits at a concert.
No. For many years I have not been singing Sephardic greatest hits. So I've always been interested in the stuff that nobody knows. Like I'll sing one or two of the songs that everybody knows just because of that biological thing that we have. You know, when we hear something that we know, it creates this very deep kind of physiological satisfaction, right? So you want to give that to the audience, right? But also you want the audience to do something else with you as well, right? So this is the kind of the dance that I'm on.
Well, thank you. This has been so enlightening, and I hope everyone who's watching will get an amazing new appreciation for what's going on in the world of Sephardic music research. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much.
We are back with Dr. Vanessa Paloma Elbaz, and we have questions. So let's see. Rivka Amado asks, can you explain how singing or playing music can enhance ethical teaching?
Yes, thank you. Well, I mean, I'll try, but thank you, Rivka. It's nice to know that you're here. So basically, I mean, I don't think that it's necessarily only specific to Sephardi. What my research is looking at is the way that Sephardi writers have been talking about the way that that music and that singing, excuse me, that music and singing can enhance ethics and kind of interact with an ethical way of being. And so what comes up repeatedly in the texts, and actually also in practice of Sephardi communities, is that it's an issue of this repetition and engagement with these repertoires that have a variety of levels attached to them. So one of the levels is the text, right? What the message is in the text, and it can be a direct message or it can be a hidden embedded message, which is something that I'm very interested in, the whole symbolic kind of background that is in the texts. But it can also be just the fact of the transmission, the person-to-person transmission and memorization of cantillation, of piyutim, of liturgical poetry, and the singing in groups, actually, that creates then this affinity with the people that you're singing with, and through that affinity, through this action of singing together and this kind of vibrational affinity, then there's a different relationship of the self to the ethical self. And so this is what these writers in the 16th century were mostly talking about, how this should be done, and this is why people should sing, but also that they needed to sing the songs in the right manner, right? So that it be in tune. And and that this isn't just singing, but that it's actually in action as well, because when a body moves, that movement creates a vibration in the world. And if you're moving, for example, to do a mitzvah, to do a good deed, then you create a positive sound. And if you're moving to do an avera or a negative deed or a sin, then that creates a negative sound. So the whole issue is that we're hoping to create more positive sounds and less negative sounds. So this is more or less the kind of the grander vision of it. I would say that there's probably, if you look at some of the works, there's a very interesting book by Shlomo Ibn Gvirol, the medieval poet and writer, that's on the rectification of the moral qualities. And he uses the different senses, so the 5 different senses, and he has something that's about the ear, which I think is really interesting. So it's not just the creation, but it's the listening as well, right? So if we listen to things coming from someone who is doing it from a pure heart, then that actually has an impact on our self as well. But I mean, this is interesting because this is something that Rabbi Nachman of Breslov also talks about. And so it's very, very active belief in, it's a very active belief in the Hasidic community as well. And something that I'm interested in looking at is, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov traveled to Jerusalem when it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and traveled to Sfat. And stayed in Constantinople for some months. So there was some connection to this kind of Sephardi knowledge with sound that has kind of permeated into the Hasidic world as well. So I think that it's really expanded into ways that Jewish teachers and mystics mostly are approaching the relationship of beingness with sound and ethics.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Alma Gottlieb that is takes us in a little bit different direction. Are you aware of any research or writings on potential Sephardic influence on either Portuguese fado or the Cape Verdean song genre of morna?
Yes, so thank you for this question. And a lot of people talk about fado sounding like Sephardi song. So this is something that we wonder. We don't have any clear trace on it yet. And Cape Verde also, we don't have any clear trace as of yet. So, but the interesting thing with both of these places is that both of them were places that have a important Jewish and crypto-Jewish migrations. And so there's a possibility that some of these musical movements and this idea of the Sontinuity that I'm talking about actually seeps into fado and morna, possibly. The issue is that we still have not made that connection backward. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is looking at the ethnographic material that we can find today and the historical materials from earlier, and then looking at the space of time in between where we don't have an obvious linkage, and seeing if there are manners that we can find linkages between the historical materials that we do have and the current ethnographic materials that we have. So this is, I think, where the research will take us in the next 10 to 15 years.
We have a question from Diane Katz. Why are most synagogue services primarily sung and not spoken? And of course, thinking of that, it's the incredible services in Morocco that are the singing is so extraordinary, you know.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are various reasons. One of them is that, well, one is that singers that have wonderful voices like to sing and kind of show their vocal abilities, right? We have this. Another one is that there's something a little bit deeper that happens to the listener when they're hearing a text that's sung or just a voice. There's something about the added intensity of a sung voice that is able to penetrate into the 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 psyche of the listener at another level than a spoken voice. A spoken voice goes uh, to the prefrontal cortex, and the sung voice can actually be have an impact that's much stronger. It can make you cry, it can make you sigh, it can make you remember um, an ancestor, it can make you remember a moment of pain or of happiness. And it's this emotional quality of the sung voice that is so powerful, which is why, and also because it's a mnemonic device, it also facilitates memorization. So when a lot of the materials were transmitted orally and not through the written word, if you would sing it, then you would remember the words much more easily. So there are all these different layers of why then actually singing and musical aspects of the transmission of belief and of beingness has been used for communities all around the world for centuries.
Michelle Safrani asks, what can you tell about the Nubas, the Moroccan, Andalusi Moroccan, in the context of your work?
Yes, so thank you for that question. We didn't talk that much about the Nuba, but yes, so in Morocco, the Nuba, which is the Moroccan Arabo-Andalusian modes, are used within the liturgy as well. And for certain moments of the year and certain, so a Nuba is actually, it's a mode, but it actually has a collection of tunes and songs that go with them, with original Arabic poetry that then has been taken, lifted, the melodies are lifted and put into the liturgy. And you can have actually one whole service on Ramel Maya, for example, on one Nuba. And so you stay within that mode during the whole service. But then inside of that, you put in the cantillation for the Torah reading, the cantillation for the Haftarah, and maybe some liturgical poems, some piyutim that have different melodies. But the basis of the liturgy for that day would be then based on Anuba. So this is something that was done a lot throughout Morocco in most of the urban areas. And I'll leave it at that. It's a very complicated system. So
A question from Helene Hartman is, she mentioned that it's been shown that music definitely influences people who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Do you think that music they hear should be something in their histories, memories, should be hearing that music, or will any music do to help in their therapy?
yeah, thank you, Helene. Hi, good to see you. Yes, it definitely should be music from their histories. I actually did an interview once with a woman in Tetuan who had very advanced Alzheimer's and who had been sitting, she lived at home. She was a Jewish woman. She had her two children. in Tetuan, and she had been sitting in her rocking chair. She had just not been well, and she lived at home with her kids, and she was sitting there and she wasn't interacting. But she had been known to be one of the best singers. So I told them, I said, I would love to hear your mom sing. And they were like, well, forget it. She just doesn't, it's been years, she hasn't been well. So I said, well, would you allow me to sing to her? And they said, sure. So I started to sing some of the songs from Northern Morocco, and she started to sing. And she did not stop singing like for 40 minutes. And she would chain one song into the other, exactly the way that people used to do at the weddings. And she would go from one song into the next song, into the next song, into the next song. And they could not believe it. And after that, they said, she has not, you really brought her out in a way that we didn't realize. So then they realized that they wanted her to then be listening to these songs more, because it was bringing back a part of her that had been so important for her, and that she immediately was able to interact in a whole other way that she hadn't had access to before.
We have a question from Nurit Pat. Was the Sad Nova concert of the last Simchat Torah named after the Moroccan one? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I don't
Nova concert.
know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know of the Nova Moroccan. Obviously, the Nova, yeah, was such a horrific tragedy.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that I recognize which is the Moroccan Nova. So if you have any more details on that, because I hadn't made any connection with anything Moroccan, but if you have any more details, that might help me relate that.
Okay. From Charlie Friedman, we have a question. Can you talk about the sensory connection between sound, music, and smell? Both are powerful and can have emotional power. Can you talk about their relationship?
Yes, thank you, Charlie. Yeah, so smell, so it's interesting because actually they say, the rabbis say that smell is the only sense that wasn't affected in the sin of Adam and Eve, because they saw the apple, they heard the snake, they touched it and they tasted it, but they did not smell it. So there's this idea that that smell wasn't affected by the blemish. So it's the only unblemished sense that we have, according to rabbinic practice. So, which is why it's actually probably maybe the last sense really to go. However, the sonic, because it's connected with vibration, there's something that's very sensorial as well with this deep vibrational non-conscious ingestion that we can make of sound, and which is why rhythm, I didn't talk a lot about rhythm in the talk, but this is one of the nonverbal aspects, actually, the rhythmic and cyclical aspects, long rhythms of time, but rhythms of music, tapping, these kinds of elements also really embed knowledge in the body. And this is, I think that this is really the next frontier of what we're looking at, is these issues of how we get out of the direct linear frontal understanding of things and kind of go in through the back door, because so much information is passing through the back door that we can't see if we're only looking at what we can actually see.
One last question. You mentioned the presence of romanceros in New Mexico and South America and so on, but being placed in New Mexico, can you comment just a bit more on that issue? What do we know about that tradition of romanceros in New Mexico?
Well, there are romances. There are certain romances that are very well known, like Herineldo, for example, and La Hermana Cautiva, that have also been collected in New Mexico anthologies of oral traditions. So we know that, and it makes sense because the Spanish diaspora was wide, and one of the things that people can carry with them easily is their knowledge, right? And so their knowledge of song. And as we know, as I've just said, that song is one of the easier ways to remember things. So when you can't carry books or other materials, other knowledge, you can actually remember even traces or pieces of songs. And people actually used to really know a lot by heart, a lot more than we do today. And so it's not surprising that that we have romances in New Mexico. We have some of the similar romances we actually have in Cuba and in Colombia and in Mexico. And so you can almost follow a trace of where things went, and where people went and how they carried these stories that then they made very local, or connected to their very local lives. So, and one of the interesting things is that the narratives that stay of the romances are basically long epic poems that have a very short melody that's repeated, that basically is helping just to tell the story. But the stories that stay are the ones that actually are relevant to people's lives. So we know that they were using them as tools for teaching, and that this is one of the ways that that their Sontinuity was working, because it was a way to pass intellectual information and information about the ethics and behavior and belief through sound and through song.
Dr. Elbaz, thank you for being with us today and going through all this information on Sephardi song, and we appreciate your presence and bringing your information to us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful and great to be able to share my research and my work and what I'm so obsessed with about all this fascinating history that we have, and what we can keep on learning and understanding from it.
To all of those who are here watching today, thank you for your presence, and we look forward to seeing you in future programs.